So thanks so much, and I'm really excited to be presenting in this session because I think this paper completely kind of meshes with the earlier two. So it's just me sitting here, even listening to the first two. I have generated some thoughts for what we're doing in this paper. So um, as you said, basically the idea here is we're using business license data to analyze the change in new establishment activity in Chicago during the pandemic. So it's a very exploratory kind of idea. And as you'll see, a lot of the work done here by my wonderful co-author, Emma, is around kind of trying to coerce this business license data set into something usable in terms of establishments. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so just to generally frame, obviously we've all lived through the pandemic. But there have been at least short-term large economic effects from business closures, also the direct impact of the people being infected themselves and all the related uncertainty in the macro economy and investment trends. Obviously we saw a huge drop in gross domestic product and unemployment that have rebounded somewhat throughout the end of 2020. Now, we finished writing this paper in this draft in November 2020. So one of the main points here is obviously like we would theoretically be able to see a continuation of all these trends through to now, and maybe even it would be more interesting to see through to the kind of end of the pandemic and the end of a lot of the lockdowns, which are starting to occur in the US. So you have to kind of hold that in your head, I guess, that this is through November, essentially. So the rest of the story remains to be seen. But we saw a big drop also in small business revenues that remained at a deficit through kind of the third quarter, particularly leisure and hospitality businesses. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. People aren't traveling, right? And investment in kind of new businesses at that level has stalled. But one of the interesting things that we saw is kind of at the aggregate US scale, which we see in this graph. So we have the 2016 and 2019 average of new businesses with planned wages. And so in quarter one and quarter two, you had a deficit, but then a huge rebound in quarter three and quarter four. And I glanced at the data the other day, and it looks like quarter one of 2021 is on track to also beat the 2016 to 2019 average. So there's a potential here, obviously something unanswered in this paper specifically, but there's an open question as to what extent are the long-term trends in these new business deficits that we see during the pandemic? Is it a short-term? Is it a long-term? Will it be particularly sticky in particular types of neighborhoods, as we kind of have seen with the recession? Which are all interesting things that we can study in the future. But what I'm interested here, these are national level effects. And so I'm trying to get at particularly neighborhood level, spatial patterns, temporal patterns, and also more fine-grained industry level effects. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the background here, but there is an extremely well-developed literature on the importance of entrepreneurship and new business creation to local and national economies. New businesses provide a range of benefits to economies. They supply a lot of employment, particularly small new businesses. They enhance competitiveness in the local economy because you have more people, obviously competing. And so the theory is that the better ideas tend to win out. They can contribute to specialized knowledge spillovers, which then contribute to innovation and productivity improvement, which eventually spin up into technological change, also enhance the competitiveness of local economic clusters. And new businesses contribute to economic diversity, which is another piece in relating to innovation, but also provides its own kind of protective portfolio benefits to local economies. With Jane Jacobs' famous Manchester and Birmingham example, where Birmingham had a slightly more diverse economy and was able to weather the storm of the change in kind of macroeconomic trends. So lots of reasons to be interested in new businesses. And then in particular, as I think probably this audience is obviously well aware of, there are also reasons to be interested in specifically independently owned and small scale retail businesses or Main Street businesses that contribute to the urban vitality of cities, right? So Jane Jacobs in The Death and Life of Great American Cities provides a range of arguments that center around kind of the role of diverse land uses, of which a lot of this is made up of these kind of small scale street level retailers and their role in kind of fostering the urban vitality and activity in neighborhoods and cities as a whole. So and so this just kind of provides some of the justification for where we'll focus a little bit more on kind of differentiating independence and chains for that reason here. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to end up using this Chicago business license data set. And the main reason for that is a lot of the common data sets that we would use on the point level to look at establishments are just not updated, frequently enough to measure the kind of fine-grained changes that we wanted to look at on the effect of a pandemic, which was, within a year of starting basically, right, in the middle of 2020. So, and actually, Patrick's discussion of SafeGraph, I'm actually not sure if SafeGraph is updated like on that fine grain of a sequence. So that might be an option. But all the traditional ones, Info USA, National Establishment Time Series, some of which are also for-profit data sources, just aren't updated often enough to study this kind of question. So, so that kind of drives the first of the main research questions here, which is essentially, can we use this open source business license data set to actually derive business establishment points that we can then use to study these fine-grained spatial and temporal dynamics? The business license data set is provided on the Chicago Open Data Portal. It's literally like the data exhaust of people applying for business licenses. So every business has to be permitted by the city of Chicago. You file an application. And so that data set is updated very, very frequently, but it's not provided on, the addresses are there, geo-referenced, but the scale of the data is at the license level, not the establishment. So one of our primary tasks here is just like, can we take this license data and get realistic estimates of establishments out of it? And then once we have that, the kind of substantive questions are, to what extent was there a decline in new business establishment starts during the pandemic compared to previous trends, by business type or between chains and independents? And then what's the spatial expression of these trends? We're interested in seeing, like, are there particular areas of the city that have been hardest hit? Chicago is well known for being one of the most segregated cities in the US. And so there's a very distinct division between Black majority and Hispanic majority and white majority neighborhoods. So the question is, are there particular demographic characteristics associated with bigger declines during the pandemic? And then one thought we had is, like, could that be related to places that were harder hit by COVID-19? In previous paper, I kind of analyzed the spatial expression of COVID-19 early on in the pandemic in Chicago, and there were very stark patterns by these kind of demographic neighborhood groupings. So we might expect that the economic trends kind of follow those COVID trends. In fact, spoiler, that is not the case for the business starts, but interesting to study that nonetheless. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the data cleaning process. As I mentioned, so the business license data comes at the license level, but we also get a business ID and an account ID, which is essentially the account ID. It would be like the whole chain. And then you have each of the individual business IDs. So that is good, and we can leverage those, particularly the business ID, which is associated with a particular location. to do our spatial analysis. But the main problem is with the classification scheme. So there are multiple license types per business ID. And then there's a separate list of business activities that the applicant can choose through an online portal. But there's not really any systematic like reference for that. So I'm not sure they're even prompted in a specific way. So if you're opening a grocery store, you know, whoever's applying for the application through the online portal may select coffee shop because there's a coffee shop in there. And it's like a very detailed list, as you can see here, of business activities. And so that presents a real problem for us because there's really not a systematic way to directly tie these together, because even within one specific grocery store chain, every individual business will have a different unique set of business activities associated with it. So what we ended up doing is kind of taking a step back and creating our own classification scheme that was very broad. So we end up with just 5 classes: retail, arts, food, and then an other classification because we just wanted to lump, you know, other things together. And you can see here, this is basically, so we took license types that would associate with that large classification and then all the business activities, and we just kind of grouped them on our own. Now, as you'll see, obviously there's some issues with this kind of classification scheme, but as Abigail was presenting, I was also thinking it might be a great idea to do what she did, which is to create the classification schemes directly, you know, in relation to the kinds of regulations we had in COVID. So we took a more broad approach where it was like food related businesses and retail. But maybe it would be good to talk about like essential businesses, leisure activities, whatever. So that's maybe something we could do in the future. Okay, so then how do we classify these things? Because there's different license types and different business activities. And so this was quite a time-consuming process, but I wanted to, it might be hard to see, but I'll just kind of explain very briefly. So this is an example of the data structure. So Walgreens is like a national pharmacy chain. So we have all the different Walgreens. They're all associated with one account number. They all have different business IDs and addresses. But within each of those business IDs, there's multiple licenses because they have a tobacco license, which is specific to tobacco, but then they also have a retail food establishment license because they sell some retail food and packaged goods, right? And then they have different combinations of these business activities. So what we decided to do is basically create a voting scheme across the account number. And so we basically aggregate all unique instances of different licenses and different business activities. So here, retail food establishment here is 1 vote, retail sales of general merchandise is a second one, et cetera, et cetera. And those are voted based on, for retail, you know, based on how those activities clump under our 5 large categories. And we only count the new issues because these licenses are renewed. And so obviously that kind of, we don't want to count a renewal of a license twice towards classifying it. Anyway, we did this voting at the account level because we ended up with different classifications for different individual establishments if we did it at the establishment level. Because again, people are filling these out differently and you don't want 2 different Walgreens stores to be classified differently. That wouldn't make any sense. So we did that at the account level, summed all the votes across our 5 categories, and then also produced a winning category. So there's an open question here is like, is this a good classification scheme, which would be obviously important and interesting to study in a future paper. But since it was kind of our best available data, the idea was to take it, and given the results and the pattern seems to be, you know, at least at kind of a everyday level, seems to pretty well reflect the actual establishment patterns. And then we delineate chains if the account had more than 4 unique locations. And we're also able to get the start dates, but unfortunately not the end dates because there's no marker in the license data set for when you don't renew, right? So that's another reason why we're studying new business starts. Okay, so the analysis was relatively straightforward. So we'll look at some temporal trends for the entire city by business type. compared, like during the pandemic time compared to pre-pandemic. Then some exploratory spatial analysis and mapping, which we used kernel density estimates for. And then we did some OLS regression with aggregating each business type to zip codes and basically looking at the difference between 2020 new businesses and the average of 2016 to 2019. So the percent difference by zip code. And then using that as a dependent variable with a variety of predictors in kind of an exploratory way to try and see, like, are places that lost business during the pandemic have particular characteristics. This Jacobs index is like a built environment walkability index that I've used in a variety of other papers. It kind of captures a lot of Jane Jacobs indicators of diversity. A social vulnerability index to kind of capture, income, public assistance, education, some social, socioeconomic status factors. And then again, the COVID rate, because that was initially one of the things that we were interested in looking at. Okay, so we'll just run through some of the results. So here's the temporal analysis. So this is on a monthly basis, going back to January of 2016, and then I've kind of highlighted in red the pandemic era. And you can see these are 6-month moving averages for each of the different types. So other also is kind of the largest category here. So one of the conclusions of this is we need to unpack the other category a bit more finally, I think, to kind of understand what's going on. But so we have the other: food, retail, personal care and fitness, and then arts. So you can see they're kind of absolute size of each category, but then the kind of seasonal patterns, right? But pretty much across the board, you can see this kind of drop in new business establishments during the pandemic time. This is about the time in the spring when that cycle would start to rise again. And particularly you can see for food, it's just kind of a direct bottoming out. So there is definitely a decline compared to the previous trend for the city as a whole. And then broken up by chain and independent versions of each business type. So this is for independent establishments. So this is just percent difference between each of these months in 2020 and the 2016 to 2019 average. So you can see, like, in January and February, pretty much around 1, meaning it's similar to the average for that month in the previous 3 years. And you can see a bottoming out for most of the business categories in April. So kind of at 40% of the typical, activity. And then we start to see some evidence of that rebound as we move into kind of the late summer and fall. The arts actually exceeds the previous pattern, but arts is particularly spiky because there just aren't a lot of, it's relatively sparse categories. So I don't know how much we can read into that. And maybe, again, that has to do with the way we're classifying things that could be tweaked. But we do see kind of this recovery close to the previous averages. For chains, we actually see a bigger drop. Now, part of this is driven by the fact that chains are much sparser than independents in our data set. And we do need to do a little bit of additional analysis, sensitivity analysis with the chain definition, because we did look at the data and there was kind of a stark break at 4. But obviously we should play with that boundary a little bit more because the number of chains is relatively lower. But we do see overall essentially bigger drops for each of the categories and just more fluctuation in general with a higher rebound. And again, it would be interesting to see what this looked like through the winter as well. But in general, the chain pattern is definitely more spiky and a little bit, they seem to be a little bit harder hit compared to the independent businesses, which if that is the case, would kind of fit with the previous literature about independent businesses being more resilient. And even as Patrick mentioned, there's a lot of discussion about obviously a lot of the activity that was allowed during the pandemic lockdowns is like the more local shopping behavior that's probably more likely to be an independent business. Okay, quickly on spatial patterns. So again, we use the kernel density estimates to kind of preserve the grain of the individual points. So what we have is like the red and orange colors are drops compared to the 2016 to 2019 average, and the blue areas are actually above the 2016 and 2019 average. Again, chains is a spikier pattern overall, but you can kind of see, and again, this without going into like a full discussion of the geography of Chicago, you actually see some drops in like Roscoe Village, Bucktown, the West Loop. These are like particularly more hip, up and coming kind of creative class type neighborhoods. And then, so those are where you see some of the biggest drops. Also around Pilsen, you can see Pilsen is another one of these kind of up and coming neighborhoods, gentrifying neighborhoods. But then some of the most well-established kind of urban inner city, high income places like Lincoln Park and in the Loop, which is a central business district, do have positive indicators. So there may be some kind of continuity from existing business activity. I mean, my hypothesis going into this was that we would see all of the kind of well-established areas at least flat or positive, and then the outlying, Hispanic and Black neighborhoods on the south side heavily negative, which is definitely not the case. So that I think was an interesting finding. Then if we actually plug in some neighborhood indicators, we see that walkability index is significant across all, when we pool everything together. Social vulnerability is negative. So basically the areas that did better compared to this 2016 and 2019 average had higher levels of walkability, less social vulnerability, less young people, which is interesting. That's kind of that indicator of the up and coming gentrifying neighborhoods. But also another interesting thing that we found across a lot of the neighborhood types is that percent Black population is actually related to this resilience during the pandemic, which I think is something that would be really interesting to unpack, and maybe this idea of community connectedness and resilience. So I'll just really quickly sum up. So we were able to use the data set, but obviously we need further work to kind of unpack our categories at the very least. Independents seem to do better than chains overall. And they have slightly different spatial patterns. And then again, the regression results point at maybe some interesting kind of theoretical connections, bigger drops in these gentrifying areas, but the importance of the 15-minute city walkable neighborhood idea, and maybe the level of increased resilience in Black communities, which would be a really interesting thing to kind of unpack further. Yeah, and then obviously, if there are questions, we can talk about some limitations in future work, but sorry, we'll end there for now.
So a question from Stefano. So on your results slide, if you can, thank you very much. Says the results graph is very interesting. It seems to suggest the pre-COVID-19 trajectory of decline simply continues through the COVID-19 era. So no apparent step change or impact. Why is that?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question, because in a way we're kind of controlling for pre-pandemic trajectory, because we're just comparing everything to its average from 2016 and 2019. So it's like, maybe you did better in 2020, but you did better compared to this declining trajectory. So that question actually makes me think that it would also be interesting to just like look at the absolute trajectory, which I guess we have here, but even if this was broken out by maybe not individual zip code, but by like, chunks of the city that we might have certain hypotheses about trajectories, that would be interesting, because it could be that that Black percent is significant and positive, but it represents like just, a moderate improvement on a very steep decline in 2020, rather than like some kind of, really measurable impact or something. So that's an interesting question. Yeah.
I just wondered myself, you mentioned about different neighborhoods perhaps fostering different levels of resilience based on the neighborhood type. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about anything you found there about Hispanic or Black communities and the impact of those neighborhood types on your business startups.
Yeah. So, like I said, I think so. As I was playing around with so social vulnerability and the walkability index were pretty robust. And as I was playing around with other variables to look at, this Black population percent was significant. Oh, and again, I didn't highlight the COVID-19 rate was really not significant in any case, but this Black population was significant across the different types, and also like if I used like just white percent as kind of the indicator, for all minority groups, that didn't function as well, and the models didn't perform as well as when we have Black percent specifically. So it makes me think that maybe there is really some kind of perhaps concerted community efforts in these local neighborhoods to shop locally that that didn't happen maybe in the generally kind of higher income, wider neighborhoods where everyone just starts ordering everything on Amazon during the pandemic, right? Now, how that would trickle through to the new business applications is another question, but I think there may definitely be something there. It's something that I think is really interesting out of that, and could be like if we could ground truth that in some specific instances, I think it would be really interesting to kind of confirm.
Another question from Stefano. So he says the 20-minute neighborhood is core to retail research in the UK. How transferable is your research to the UK?
Yeah, this is a really good question too. I think I haven't thought a lot about it in terms of, so I just, recently made the move to Maynooth in Ireland. So I've been thinking about, the same kind of in this European, UK, Irish context. Would we see the same kind of patterns related to the pandemic? But I haven't. So I think this a general approach, obviously the data and everything is a little bit specific to my application in Chicago, but I think thinking about like the connections and what happened during the pandemic is definitely something that I'm interested in, as well as this question of basically the question of geodemographics, like how are we tying the demographic characteristics to these points in a meaningful way? And so Patrick and Les and Alex's work obviously on that is really useful. And I think maybe we could get closer to answering that question in the UK context where like that work is more established, obviously. But I think using Patrick's boundary definitions for Chicago, probably, if we could tie that to demographic characteristics in a good way, that might be also something we could explore.